On today's episode,
my life depends on this. I mean, let's not get this wrong. I am a C6 quadriplegic. I don't get out of bed. I cannot evacuate my bowel. I cannot get on with life unless I have an adequate NDIS plan that meets my reasonable and necessary support requirements and allows me to exercise choice and control.
Do we have to do that again? Yes. Is the answer? Yes, we've all got to do it again. And I don't mean shiny corporate communications about how great the NDIS is. I mean about how this kind of support that is world leading has changed lives. It continues to change lives. Telling that story about public investment in the care and support that everybody will require at some part in their life is a really important thing that we could do.
so we've seen there's restrictive support lists, we've seen funding periods that divide people's lives into months rather than recognising that our needs can go up and down. How did we end up here when the promise was greater choice and control? Hi, I'm Dr. George Taleporos, and welcome to Reasonable and Necessary, Australia's go-to podcast on the NDIS. In this episode, I speak with Gibbs and Dougie Herd, co-chairs of the NDIS Reform Advisory Council. Join us as we unpack the biggest changes to our NDIS, support needs assessments, appeals, individualised living, and what we need from the government to make it work. Hey, Alan Dougie, welcome to the show.
Hey, George, thanks for having us.
Hello, George. Very happy to be here.
So you are both the chairs of the NDIS Reform Advisory Council. For people who don't know what that is, can you give us a bit of an explanation of what you do and why it's important?
The Reform Advisory Committee was stood up at the beginning of last year, and it reports into the Disability Reform Ministers' Council. So that's a fancy way of saying all of the disability ministers from around Australia at the state and territory level, plus the Commonwealth. We're looking particularly at the reforms that have come out of the NDIS review. So it's got quite a narrow focus, but really important one in terms of keeping a really solid eye on what is happening with the reforms and, you know, across the diversity of our community. So we've got people with disability, families, carers, providers, big and small, and the public sector as well at the table, which makes it a lively conversations but a surprising degree of, uniform concern about how those reforms are being implemented.
Elle talked about our narrow role, and we think that's absolutely right. We are not a disabled people's representative organisation. We're not an advocacy organisation or body, and our terms of reference are simple and clear. To amplify directly to government in the Commonwealth, the states and territory disability ministers, to amplify the perspectives that we hear from the disability community through its representative organisations, attending forums, as you know, George, like the Community Forum of the Every Australian Counts campaign, to be a nationwide body drawn from each state and territory and the Commonwealth to reflect on what we hear across the spectrum of views about reform and do our best to feed that back faithfully directly to ministers. And also the second kind of fundamental term of reference that we have is to advise government on how well we think consultations involve people with disability and their organisations.
That's a massive job, and as we all know, there's a lot of concerns out there, and we're going to try and dig into those and also think about what's the way forward for our community. And I'd like to begin by unpacking probably the main concern right now, because support needs assessments aren't that far away for our community. So let's start there. A key concern is that we're moving from the current system where participants can provide evidence from people that know them well. So a new system where government officials, who many of us have never met before, many who might be allied health qualified, will be assessing our needs. Are you elevating those concerns to the minister right now?
I was a member of the panel of the independent NDIS review, and so I'm a contributor to the recommendations, and I'm not here to speak on behalf of the review because that's ancient history. But this is, I hope, useful in terms of this current conversation and about where we're going. One of the first things the review did when it was first established, so that's going even further back to 2022, was convened a 3-day meeting in Canberra, online also. And absolutely central to those 3 days, most of those 3 days, were given over to the review meeting with and hearing from NDIS participants and their families, and from disability advocacy organisations, the kind of funded advocacy organisations that are still doing the work now today. Not one person that we heard from in those 3 days, or in the 12 months of the review, or in the years since the review was published, not a single sentient human being said that the status quo of NDIS planning should remain. Everybody said that it's not working, that there's arbitrary decisions, that it's not clear how people's plans have been developed from time to time. If I consider my own life, and I don't like talking about myself when we're talking about reform, but you mentioned concern about people who we might meet in the future. I've never had my own plan assessed by the same planner twice in a row. I've always met strangers who don't know me at all, except what they read in the information that they've seen in their files. And they've made decisions about my life and my supports without a clear, consistent, uniform, fair and equitable planning framework. And I think that that's ought to be everybody's starting point. We need to get away from the current system because it hasn't been working for 5 years. And that's indeed part of the reason I understand the government's decided they wanted a review in the first place. But amongst the many things I think we've been saying as a RAC, to anyone who'll listen, all of our meeting summaries are on the Department of Health, Disability and Ageing website. The RAC met just last Friday, and we've developed a piece of formal advice that we will transmit to the government. We'll hand it over to them. It will go to the DRMC, that Disability Reform Ministers Council, all the ministers. I'm hoping that it will be a published document that you can see what recommendations, advice we're giving to government. But here's, I hope, what will not be a surprise. It looks very like the kind of things that, for instance, were said in the joint statement by disability representative organisations last week about people don't understand how the changes will be implemented. People have not seen all of the proposed amendments to rules. And it's very difficult to give good, coherent, rights-based feedback if you don't know all of the elements. But I've also, just to make it clear, I've also heard senior public servants in public meetings and online consultations say that there will be transparency about the rules, that we will see what the formula might be for how a plan is developed. I think it's completely understandable that participants, families, disabled people's organisations should be expressing their absolutely correct desire to see the totality of the changes that are proposed so that we can give the best advice possible and the best advocacy possible to government to get it right.
One thing I will add to what Dougie was saying, and I completely agree with him, is that it is really hard, I think, for people to understand what is happening. There isn't a lot of information in public, and the information that was put out to consult on was pretty hard going. And I found it hard going, and I'm up to my armpits in this stuff. And so there hasn't been a clear kind of roadmap about what's happening and when it's going to happen and to which communities. Dougie's talked a lot about the beginnings of the NDIS. I was there too, and I remember there was a clear roadmap. People knew when things were going to happen and which communities would come into the scheme. We need a whole lot more better information. You know, we've been saying how worried and upset and distressed our community is since the beginning of our appointment. So it's not that we don't know that and that we are not reflecting that. I think the community can continue to push for as much transparency as possible in the mechanisms about how this is going to work. You know, how the support needs assessment, we know a fair bit about how that might work. We don't know anything about how the budget calculator, like the missing middle part, is. And we know a little bit about how the flexible budgets will work. But there's a whole lot of missing elements still, and we really need to see those and understand how they will work together for all the different parts of our community. So, you know, for different disabled people who live in different places who have access to different amounts of support. So it is going to be, and it's getting urgent in terms of when we see that information, and we need better communications about what is happening, when, to who, and that feels like the urgent information gap, and that is not helping anyone feel secure about the big changes that are coming.
We absolutely need more information. I was running a peace portrait for participants on Monday night, and there was a mother there whose daughter was living in a really fantastic arrangement where she had all the support that she needed, and she was really terrified of how this new approach will affect her funding. And I think the fact that we don't understand how the assessment will translate into a budget, people are thinking the worst. We're deeply concerned about what that translation or what that calculation will look like. And I'm just interested in hearing from you, how can we ensure that these algorithms or these computations that will turn the assessment into a budget, how can we ensure that it's not going to lead to plans being inappropriately or unfairly cut?
It's a great question, and it's one that I think everyone has been asking. It's certainly the Joint Standing Committee's report that came out that I know you talked about, George, also recommended a lot more transparency about how that budget calculator is going to work. I'm using that language quite deliberately because I think that algorithms have been used when, like the language of algorithms is used when we don't know if there is going to be an algorithm or not. I think the opportunity for the community to have their say about the support needs assessments has been recently. There's been lots of submissions and, you know, we're certainly taking account of those and reading them and paying attention to them. As far as I understand, the way that the support needs assessment process is going to happen is going to be much longer term and over many years. So with a degree of evaluation and testing to make sure, to see what was going to happen and make sure what you're saying in terms of their unforeseen outcomes, etc. That is what's been promised in terms of what officials have said in estimates and what people have said publicly about the process. I'm really keen super keen to see much more detail about that exact process. So I want to know how the evaluation is going to work. I want it to be public. I want to see what is going to happen if that missing middle part, that calculator, gets it wrong. What happens then? And how do we make sure that people are going to, if there is a big change in someone's life, that rings alarm bells and that there is attention and a human involved in all of that. I definitely want to see that. In terms of that particular example that you used, for people who are living in, who have high support needs, have big plans, they're not part of the first part of the support needs assessment. So the agency's made that really clear and said that in publicly in the estimates, etc., that there will be extra modules about home and living, about assistive technology, home modifications, etc. And they are going to take time to get that right. That's what they've told us, and that's what they've told our community publicly. And I have to take that at their word for now, and until I see any other details. Dougie.
I want to know these things as a human being because my life depends on this. I mean, let's not get this wrong. I am a C6 quadriplegic. I don't get out of bed. I cannot evacuate my bowel. I cannot get on with life unless I have an adequate NDIS plan that meets my reasonable and necessary support requirements and allows me to exercise choice and control. And I'm using those wanky words from the NDIS legislation because in a democracy, I treat the laws of the land seriously. We have United Nations Convention rights. They are referenced and enshrined in the NDIS Act. And so the question isn't about whether or not these are desirable. I read the Australian Financial Review's ghastly article about whether or not supports to allow people with disability to have a reasonable, supported access to civil and community participation, as we call it in the jargon of the NDIS. Some expert who I've never heard of, don't know anything about, and I think he's about as expert on the NDIS as I am on nuclear physics. I hear those people saying we're a burden and a cost, and we're not really sure if it's worthwhile spending money on us so that we can do things. And I think, well, if it's not to do things, why are we here? And going into the future, we're not asking for perfect. We're asking for transparency. I think what we're asking for is greater democratic control, not less, which boils down in a sense to, when it comes to these reforms, and forgive me if I sound super jargony here, my rights as a participant that are enshrined in a law, I think will be strengthened if we elevate some of the decision-making around plans into what are known as Category A rules, rather than to be left to the, sometimes it appears, whims of an agency that is under-resourced, has been under-resourced, has been under immense pressure in an ecosystem that wasn't fit for purpose, still isn't, but we hope will become fit for purpose. Because those rules that govern the planning assessment, the way in which the budget's set, how the disability supports are to be described and all that sort of stuff, those will be subject to change and scrutiny and review by disability ministers in all jurisdictions of Australia, not just the Commonwealth Minister, and will make it more transparent for all of us to know whether or not what we're being offered is good, better, or much the same as before. I hear lots and lots of organisations, advocates and lawyers say, one of the things we want to know about this process is what will be our redress rights. And so those questions aren't answered, but they need to be answered. They need to be in rules. They need to be subject to change. And I hope we'll get to a position where we create a framework that we all know about, we all understand, and that we can work with. But that includes, never mind the noodly bits of law about the ART and all the rest of it. Simple things like today, I received my NDIS provider update newsletter. And in it, in a section on the new planning framework, it says the whole change process will begin at a small scale. Well, in a participant base of 750,000 people, what is the definition of small? As Elle said, we've heard and we've read the agency saying participants under the age of 18 are not going to be part of it. That's clear. That's sort of binary in the first instance. And assessment processes will develop. And we've also read and heard people say complex people might not be part of it in the first instance or at the tail end. But I think everybody deserves a clear definition from the implementing agency of what does the word complex mean in your understanding of what will happen. And we need that clarity, and we need the time to make sense of it.
I want to take it back to that issue around appeals, because this is a real concern, and I've spoken to some really, smart people who know a lot more about the law than I do, and the concern here is that you'll be able to ask for another assessment, but if that assessment comes back with the same results, you are stuck. Well, at the moment, you have more options and rights because the tribunal can review the reasonable necessary funding amounts. What can we do to fix that? So that if that, let's go back to that parent, if their daughter comes back with an assessment that says, we're going to cut it and you're going to have to live in a group home, that someone actually can get that fixed.
So in terms of that particular example that you've used, we don't know, because the extra modules that are meant to go alongside the support needs assessment around things like home and living haven't been developed yet. They are years away. So that is not something I can give any kind of answer to, because it just doesn't exist yet. But in terms of that terrible cycle where the budget amount pops out at the end and someone will go, hang on a minute, that's totally inadequate for my needs. I do want a replacement assessment. You go back to the beginning of the process, you get another support needs assessment. It goes through the mystery budget calculator that we don't know about. It pops out the same amount. And that loop I've called the cycle of doom, because it doesn't give you enough input. And I have asked lots of questions. I'm not going to speak for Dougie or other members of the RAC, but I've certainly been asking questions about how is that process going to work? How is it, if it is wrong, what are you going to do? And if it is, different from their original plan by a certain amount, is there a safeguard in place? Have you put it in place? Something, if it spits out that you get 50% less support, alarms should be going off, like something's gone wrong. So that's certainly an area that I focused on in terms of questioning and how that is going to work. Again, the rules are still not finalised. So there is opportunity at the moment for people to influence that and to continue to talk about solutions that they can propose for how that might work differently.
What should we be asking for, Elle?
I am certainly not going to suggest what people should be asking for. I can tell you what I have suggested. I've talked a couple of times about alarm bells, within the agency. When I worked at Dana, I spent a lot of time on the phone with advocates across the country when things would go terribly wrong. So I'm aware of what happens when things go terribly wrong with the agency. And there should be a absolute automatic klaxon alarm when there is a big shift in someone's support, particularly when there's a huge drop, because you have to go back to the person and their family and their providers and go, hang on a minute, what's happened here? What have we missed? How has this happened? And what's going to happen in that person's life if it isn't rectified? So I have been talking a lot about, and Dougie will know this, I've become boring around evaluation and testing and, transparency, and making sure that at every single point in this process, the NDIA keeps in mind always that this is about people. This is about the lives of disabled people and our families. And, as we talked about before, being able to be in the world as equal citizens. This is not nice to have. This stuff is absolutely essential. And so I am banging on a lot around evaluation and testing, because I think that's the only way to really figure it out. And the agency, has been pretty clear at estimates and other places that they've talked about some of the testing that they've done. I haven't seen the results of that yet. So I'm keen to do so, and keen to, again, understand what mechanisms they have to amend either the support needs assessment, the budget calculator, and how it's going to work.
We know that there are far too many people who are forced into group homes that either don't want to be there or don't need to be there. What is the Reform Advisory Council doing to influence policy in this area so that less people are forced into that circumstance and people can, have real choice and control over where we live and who we live with and who provides our support?
I don't live in a group home, but ever since I've met people in group homes who've expressed a view about it, they've said that they wanted more choice over how and with whom, if anyone, they live. Amongst the recommendations of the review were suggestions that we needed to reform coordination, which I worked in for 8 years, that might become something called navigation, that might include specialist kinds of navigators that would work with people specifically to look at their supported independent living arrangements, their home and living arrangements, their individual choices about that, and work with them to make the kinds of changes they chose to make. Now, that all sounds like motherhood and apple pie, all of which we like. But it's critically important, I think, for the kinds of people, the groups of people, the tens of thousands of people who live in shared living at the moment. Because when I worked as chief executive of a support coordination organisation, coordinators in our team were working with people in traditional, not very imaginative, I would argue, costly group homes, some of whom had been living together for 30 years and even 40 years, and who we knew had never once been asked by the system if that's actually how they want to live. Which is not to say that group home providers are bad people and bad organisations. It is that we have not yet realised, for those people with high levels of support needs, the full panoply of choice and control over their own lives. And the sooner we get some specialist, expert people in their lives that we might call NDIS coordinators or navigators, specifically to ask them about how they want to live into the future, that change becomes very difficult and is more than just a question about money. And so we've all got to work that out as quickly as we can together, but front and centre of that have to be the people who are currently living in group homes. And the last thing to complicate this, because one of our members of the RAC, Catherine McAlpine, would probably beat the pair of us up if we didn't mention it to you, that well over half of people who are supported by the NDIS need some kind of supported decision-making, person, agent, service in their lives to help them make decisions. None of us are surprised about that, but we've not yet got that kind of inclusive choice and control, framework of supported decision-making for NDIS participants that the future will require?
Yes, 100%. And I think it also comes down to building capacity of people that people do become quite institutionalized when they've been in a mini institution for most of their life. So we need to invest more in supporting people to get out and know that there's other possibilities outside of that.
There are some good models, and there are places where things are working. You know, I think up in Newcastle in New South Wales, Hunter Circles and CEDA are doing incredible work on the literal smell of an oily rag to create circles of support and micro boards and a range of community, peer supports for people to do that work exactly, George, to spend the long periods of time to build trust, to, if you say to a person who's only lived in a group home or an institution, do you want to stay in a group home? I reckon if they've never lived anywhere else other than an institution, rationally, people will go, yeah, this seems all right. Where that's not a real choice. That's not capacity building. It's not support for decision making. So I think that support for that kind of infrastructure around people with higher support needs is so precarious, and it is as important as other parts of the NDIS, and yet things aren't, we talk about the information linkage of capacity building grants, foundational supports, the peer support, the community sector organisations that work with people with disability and families to say, hey, there might be other options. There might be things that are different. You might have other places you could think about that might be better. Let's try and have those conversations. To do that work is highly skilled, takes an enormously long time. It needs investment, it needs time. And yet we don't get to have conversations about how we build that infrastructure, from disabled people, from the people who support and love us, around all of us, to make sure we get to do that. I think it's one of those, we've talked about tier 2 foundational supports, it is a very big missing part. We spend a lot of money on providers, but we don't spend any money on this other part of the system that could help people have the choices that other disabled people have, and that non-disabled people just bloody take for granted all the time. So I really would like to see us thinking about that. And there is some parts of the scheme and some parts of our community we should spend more money on. We always talk about the NDIS as cutting costs, but there are people who need us to spend money because they have, suffered, and they're the ones who have lived in institutions. We owe them. We owe them a dignified, older life of their choosing, where they're free of abuse, free of violence, free of restrictive practices, and actually get to do the things that they want, whatever that is.
I agree. 100% we need to invest more in capacity building. I also add that I think that we need to recognise that it's not just about the funding, but there are better ways of doing things with the same envelope of funding. And I think that individualised living arrangements where people can live with a person, a friend of their choice, that can be a really great way of giving them a better life, more social control, and it doesn't have to cost the government more.
And I think for lots of younger disabled people, that's exactly what they're doing. I'm very keen to see how we manage to push along things like independent living options.
Let's talk about that. The NDIS review did talk very strongly that we have more social control, and that was how it was essentially sold to our community. You'll get a budget and then you can go off and spend it. But what we've seen so far is more of the restrictions. So we've seen these restrictive support lists, we've seen funding periods that divide people's lives into months rather than recognising that our needs can go up and down. How did we end up here when the promise was greater social control?
You're right. The NDIS review did have a kind of trade-off that the things would change, but the benefit for our community would be a more flexible budget. And that certainly, as far as we know, is still the goal, that there is still to be a more flexible budget for people within the constraints of the support lease. So I think when the next round of consultation comes around is an opportunity for people to say, this has to be in there, this has to not be in there, this is really important that you get right. I am not a constitutional lawyer and I don't have an answer as to why we have to have these bloody lists, but they are there. And as Dougie says, it's kind of like that's just the reality of what we have. I also think that the bigger picture is worth us talking about, because the threats to the NDIS are real. And I really want people to understand that, you know, we see a lot of negative stories written about the cost of the NDIS. They are going to increase. There is a large amount of commentary, including from the more conservative parts of our politics, but also from, you know, Treasury economists, those kind of people who say that the spending on the NDIS is causing other problems for other people and are pitting disabled people against other parts of our community. Now, I think that's utterly wrong. Wrong in fact, wrong in politics, wrong in morals, ethics, just to be super clear. But there are parts of government and the opposition that listen to it and take it seriously. And so we need to take it seriously, not in terms of accepting that it's true, but understanding that there are parts of government that look at the spending on the NDIS as a massive problem. And so I think when we're having these bigger conversations about the scheme and about reform and about change, understanding that, I'm not saying agreeing with it, just to be super 100% clear, but understanding that that is a big pressure on the scheme and on the people who work in the scheme, the people making decisions about it, is incredibly important for us to understand. So starting to articulate some of the economic benefits, some of the life benefits, some of the values that we have as disabled people is also really important. I know it feels like, particularly for three of us having this conversation, oh God, we've done an awful lot of that over the years. Do we have to do that again? Yes. Is the answer? Yes, we've all got to do it again. And I don't mean shiny corporate communications about how great the NDIS is. I mean about how this kind of support that is world leading has changed lives. It continues to change lives. Telling that story about public investment in the care and support that everybody will require at some part in their life is a really important thing that we could do.
And I think it may sound like an old-fashioned cliche, but I believe it's true, that unity is strength, and that those who oppose us, let me say, this is my personal view, of course, the Australian Financial Review, for example, seek to divide us one from another, to tell us that we don't matter, to tell us that we cost too much. And we've got to work out amongst ourselves the really critical things that matter.
100% unity is strength. I just feel like I need to talk to those journalists and say, the NDIS is actually for you and for anyone who at any point in time could become disabled, and you have wanted to enable you to leave the house and to have a decent and ordinary life. That's what we all want, and that's what we're all fighting now to protect. Do you have any final words for our viewers?
I suppose I wanted to reassure everybody that the RAC is of the community, and we are having the same conversations behind closed doors to ministers as we're having in public. But it absolutely is representative of the different parts of the scheme and the different people who use the scheme, and, you know, is giving really good quality advice to the people that matter. And hopefully we'll be able to see that in public soon. But it's a job that Dougie and I take very seriously, as do the RAC members, and appreciate all of the work that so many disabled people and their families are doing on this reform. there are so many people working to make this fairer and to make this okay for disabled people. So I know this is scary, and I know we need lots more information and advice, but there are so many of us working incredibly hard to try at different parts of the process and with our eyes on the game. So,
can I just ask you, what would you say to that one who was telling me how concerned that she is about the future of her daughter as a result of what's coming?
I hear that story all the time. I think there are an enormous amount of very anxious, particularly older parents, really, really worried that what they were promised about security, safety, certainty is not going to be delivered. They are forefront in my thinking. My advice always to people is join an organisation. We're stronger together. So find out information. You're not alone. But also for people who are the most impacted, people who have the highest support needs, there are a lot of people going to make sure they are okay.
I'm going to thank both of you for your work chairing the council and for your entire careers of advocacy and standing up for the rights and needs of our community. And I really hope that we can meet again and see where things are at in 12 months' time. We'll really enjoy listening to what you have to say. Thank you both.
Thanks so much, George.
Bye, everyone.
That's all we have time for on today's episode of Reasonable and Necessary. As you know, we love your feedback, so please share your thoughts or questions in the comments section below. Thanks for listening, and until next time, stay well and reasonable.